Imagine waking up on a dirt floor, wrapped in rags, with nothing to eat and no money to buy food. You don't have a home, just a leaky hut, a corner of a barn, or maybe a pile of hay in an alley. Disease is everywhere, work is grueling and scarce, and winter could easily kill you. This was the daily struggle of the poorest in medieval times, people who had nothing but their own resilience. Today, we're stepping into their world to see how they fought starvation, found warmth, and scraped by in a brutal society. Could you have survived medieval poverty? Let's find out. Scavenging a meal, how the poorest found food. For the medieval poor, finding food was a daily battle. If you had no land, no job, and no money, your stomach was at the mercy of chance, charity, or crime. The first option? Foraging. The desperate scoured fields, forests, and roadsides for anything remotely edible. Wild berries, roots, acorns, even dandelions. Gleaning leftover grains from harvested fields was another option, though lords sometimes forbade it. During famines, people ate tree bark, boiled grass, or anything that wouldn't kill them outright. Then there was begging. Positioning themselves near churches, markets, or roads, the poor relied on Christian charity. Monasteries sometimes provided alms, stale bread, weak pottage, or a bit of meat on feast days. However, as the poor multiplied, laws against vagrancy grew harsher. By the late Middle Ages, sturdy beggars, those capable of work, were whipped or jailed instead of fed. Theft was riskier but common. A stolen loaf of bread could mean survival, but getting caught could cost a hand, or your life. Petty thieves were flogged or put in stocks, while repeat offenders faced execution. In desperate times, people raided food storage or even dug up graves for sustenance, grim evidence of how extreme hunger could become. Even when food was found, it was rarely enough. The poor often survived on thin gruel, hard bread, and whatever scraps they could get. Malnutrition was rampant, with children stunted from poor diets. For the medieval poor, every meal was a gamble, and starvation was never far away. Staying warm, how the poorest survived. Brutal winters. When temperatures dropped, the medieval poor had few defences against the cold. There was no insulation, no modern heating, just rags, fire, and sheer endurance. The first strategy? Layering everything they owned. Wool was the warmest fabric available, but it was expensive. The poorest wore patched-up tunics, old cloaks, and stuffed their clothes with straw for insulation. Wrapping feet in rags or dried grass helped keep them from freezing. Huddling for warmth was another tactic. Entire families, and sometimes animals, slept together in a single room for shared body heat. Cows, pigs, and chickens were like medieval space heaters, keeping homes slightly warmer. If you had no shelter, sleeping in haystacks or burrowing into hollowed-out earth was an option. Fires were a lifeline, but they weren't easy to maintain. Firewood was scarce, and stealing it from a lord's land was punishable by death. Instead, the poor burned dried dung, peat, or whatever they could find. At night, they buried hot stones under blankets for warmth. Winter was deadly for those without shelter. People froze to death in their homes, and many vagabonds were found stiff in the streets by morning. Staying warm was a constant fight, one that many lost. If you survived the winter, you counted yourself lucky. Dirty jobs and desperate labour, how the poor made a living. To survive, the medieval poor took any job they could get, no matter how dirty, dangerous, or degrading. Many became day labourers, ploughing fields, herding animals, or hauling stones for pennies. Others worked in tanneries, dye pits, or cesspools, where exposure to filth and chemicals cut life expectancy short. Gong farmers, latrine cleaners, dug out human waste at night, a job so revolting that it paid surprisingly well. For women, work was even more limited. Some became washerwomen, scrubbing clothes in freezing rivers. Others worked as servants, enduring long hours and abuse. Many turned to prostitution, one of the few ways a woman could make money without land or a husband. Brothels existed, but street workers had zero protection and high mortality rates. Children worked too, gathering firewood, cleaning stables, or running errands. Some were forced into apprenticeships, essentially unpaid labour for years in exchange for food and shelter. When jobs dried up, crime became a last resort. Pickpocketing, highway robbery, and even grave robbing were desperate choices. The punishment? Mutilation, branding, or hanging. It was a brutal world, and those at the bottom had few choices: work, steal, or starve. Battling disease, how the poor avoided or didn't avoid death. The medieval poor lived in filthy, overcrowded conditions, perfect for disease. Without sanitation, sickness was a daily reality. The most common killers? Dysentery, tuberculosis, and plague. Contaminated water led to constant outbreaks of the flux, severe diarrhea, while cramped, smoky huts weakened lungs. Malnutrition made the poor even more vulnerable to infections. When sickness struck, there were few options for treatment. Physicians were for the rich. The poor relied on folk remedies and religious faith. They used herbs, garlic, and amulets to ward off disease. Holy relics and pilgrimages were seen as cures, but in reality, they offered false hope. During plagues, the poor suffered the worst. Cramped housing turned slums into death traps. With no money to flee, they died in droves, their bodies piled into mass graves. Medieval hospitals, run by monasteries, gave basic care, but most patients never left alive. Infant mortality was sky high. Many children never made it past age 5. Life expectancy was around 30 to 40 years, though starvation and disease often cut it shorter. Survival was a roll of the dice, and the poor rarely won. Home sweet hovel, where the poorest lived. Medieval poverty meant horrific living conditions. Homes were tiny, damp, and barely livable. A typical poor dwelling. A one-room hut made of sticks, mud, and straw. Floors were bare earth, sometimes covered in rushes, which became infested with lice, fleas, and rats. A single fire pit filled the room with smoke, but without it, the hut became an icebox. For the homeless, life was worse. Some squatted in abandoned buildings, while others slept in barns, alleys, or dugouts in the earth. Entire families crowded into wooden shacks where disease spread like wildfire. In cities, the poor lived in slum-like tenements, packed into tiny, filthy rooms. These areas stank of sewage, since waste was often tossed into the streets. Fires, floods, and collapses were common. Despite the misery, community was key. Neighbours helped each other, sharing what little they had. A bowl of gruel, a patch of firewood, these small acts kept people alive. Without them, medieval poverty was a death sentence. Surviving medieval poverty was a never-ending fight against hunger, cold, disease, and back-breaking labour. Every meal was uncertain, every winter a test, and every illness a potential death sentence. And yet, the poor endured, relying on community, sheer willpower, and a bit of luck. Their lives were filled with suffering, but their resilience shaped history. Next time you turn up the thermostat or grab a snack from the fridge, remember, you would not have lasted a day in their shoes.